Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Christian Skeptic. I'm your host, Sean Kerwin, and as always, it's my mission to take an honest look at our questions about Christianity through the lens of logic and reason. I'm not here to preach at you, just to start a conversation with you. I hope you enjoy the show. Well, today is a unique episode. We are going to be talking about, if you couldn't already infer from the title, bread and the role of bread in the Bible. And for the first time, I actually have two guests on one show with me. So that's very exciting. I have Sarah Gelvin and Keira Jisa here with me. And they have a pretty unique story. Both of them have very unique stories that kind of revolve around a company, but most definitely revolve around bread and the Bible. So Sarah and Keira, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having us. We're excited to be here.
So another first, the podcast is also on the road for the first time. I am recording not in my hometown of Albuquerque, New Mexico, but in Kansas City, Missouri. So this is a fun event. So I guess without further ado, let's get into this. So the Bible talks a lot about bread. And in our current day and age, there are a lot of people that I want to say are opposed to bread, but that's probably not the right word. But there are strong feelings around bread and gluten because people have gluten allergies. And yet the Bible talks about eating bread, like literally the Bible calls itself the bread, or I guess Jesus calls himself the bread of life. So how do we reconcile the Bible talking about bread with people not being able to eat bread and have gluten allergies? And what are your stories with that? Let's start with you, Sarah.
Yeah, that's such a great question. So for most of my life, I have loved bread. I mean, even as a little girl, I just ate as much bread as I could, as often as I could. And for as long as I could remember, just like you said, I heard Jesus is the bread of life. But as I got older, you sort of start to feel not only guilty eating bread, because all of the diets tell you to cut out gluten, cut out bread. That's the way to be healthy. But I also physically didn't feel as well as I was eating more bread. And for me personally, I would get headaches. In hindsight, now I know that it was from the type of bread that I was eating.
So were you diagnosed with a gluten allergy or something then?
No, I was not diagnosed. I
Okay.
had gotten headaches since first grade. I now know that in part that was largely to bread. So I do think I had a sensitivity, not actually to the gluten. We'll find later that gluten gets blamed for a lot of the sensitivities, but really it's the way that we process flour that causes the problems. So whole grain wheat, straight out of the field, the way God made it, is one of the most nutritious foods in the world. It has 40 of the 44 key essential nutrients that our bodies need to survive, and it has the active enzyme our bodies need to properly digest the gluten. So when you eat it as a whole food, that whole grain has the tool your body needs to be nourished without the bloating and the carb crash and the skin issues and the digestive issues and all of that. But when you crush it into flour and then process it in America, we strip away the nutrients, we treat it at high temperatures, and so those nutrients are lost. They oxidize and the enzymes denature, and what you're left with is really an impartial food or an incomplete food and a dead food. It's no longer living. And then on top of that, they add in a lot of chemicals to enhance the baking performance and so forth. And so what we find is that we're reacting to gluten because it doesn't have that enzyme, and the chemicals that are in the flour are very toxic for our bodies. And so we see a wide variety of health issues because of a response to the chemicals. So that long explanation is to say there's a really easy way to be able to enjoy bread without the toxins and with all the health benefits. You simply make your own flour at home.
Okay, so there's kind of three things you said there that I want to ask a bit more on. You said there's two things that are removed, the 40 nutrients, so the 40 nutrients are removed from all store-bought bread and processed bread, or are there some nutrients that are still in the bread?
Great question. So the first piece you need to understand is that when you think of whole grains, they start with 40 of the 44 key nutrients. So let's use something that we're all familiar with as a point of illustration. Take an apple. If you cut an apple, it's going to start to go brown, right? That's oxidation. The same thing happens to the nutrients in whole grains. They begin to oxidize as soon as they're ground into flour. So time is the enemy of nutrition in this case. And so when you think of commercial processing, how long does flour sit on a shelf, let alone the supply chain that it had to go through before? It's a very long time for that oxidation to be taking place. And some experts estimate that up to 90% of some of those key nutrients have oxidized within 3 days of milling the grain into flour. So naturally, the nutrients are lost. On top of that, the processing of the flour is at very high temperatures that the nutrients and enzymes can't survive. And then the third reason is commercial flour in America is very sifted, and they remove, just like you mentioned, the two most nutritious parts of the grain, which are the bran and the germ. And so that's where you get a lot of the healthy oils and vitamins and minerals. They're sifted away, and they actually sell it to farmers as like cattle and pig feed. And so the animals are getting more nutrients than we are.
So what are the 40 like nutrients? And you don't have to list them all, but like what's like a, because you just say nutrients, right? And I'm thinking like, I don't know
like
exactly
folate,
what that is. Okay.
Super helpful for brain. It's folate, magnesium, zinc, goes down the list. Minerals, B vitamins, amino acids. So on you can go online and look at what those 40 out of 44 are. There are drastic drops. You can still get fiber, but sadly, if it's been treated at high temperature, the fiber doesn't have the same antioxidants, which is the glory of the way that God made the whole grain. When you eat it after you've crushed it yourself, those antioxidants are embedded in the bran, and they make it all the way to your colon, which is so helpful. There are studies that show eating at least 25 grams of whole grain or fiber a day actually like decreases your risk of, I have it here, 19% reduction in all-cause mortality, 20% reduction in heart disease, 14% reduction in stroke, 33% reduction in type 2 diabetes, 13% reduction in colorectal cancer, 16% reduction in cancer mortality. So there's so many things that so many Americans are like struggling with. And there's like God created like a lot of things that are meant to aid our bodies. And we've just destroyed them with our processing, the American way of processing it. But it was mentioned all the way back in Genesis 3, like you said, all throughout the Bible. And so it's not the whole grain that's the problem. It's what we've done to it, which is, I mean, that's the story of the Bible, right? All throughout time, God made things perfectly. And then we as humans have destroyed them trying to get something that's prettier, that's loftier. We want a really soft, fluffy bread. And that looks great, but we've destroyed the health of it in the process.
Throughout history, it's actually been a status symbol to have very soft, fluffy, white bread because historically it meant that you were rich enough to be able to afford slaves. And we see this in a variety of different cultures. Sifting flour is very common for the wealthy. And you can look at history and see that the wealthier the person was, the whiter their bread, the fewer nutrients they had, and the earlier they died. And in some cases, the slaves were fed the siftings, the throwaway parts. But those were the most nutritious parts of the grain, and they actually lived to be, in one case in particular that we're referencing in America, they lived to be in their 90s. So
that's fascinating. How far back does that go with white bread being a status symbol?
Very far back. I don't know a specific date, but I know that in the Bible, there's actually a Bible verse, and it's talking about, in Proverbs 23, it says, when you sit down to eat with a ruler, observe carefully what's before you, and put a knife to your throat, lest you be given to gluttony. Do not desire his delicacies, for they are deceitful foods. And so we heard this verse first from Sue Becker, who's kind of a legend in the fresh flour community. She puts it so well of like the wealthier the person, when you sit down to eat with a ruler, be careful, don't trust the dainties. Well, what are the dainties and delicacies? Fluffy white breads and pastries and that sort of thing. They're void of nutrients. This has been super impactful for me in my faith journey. This concept of God created whole grains to be eaten in full. And when you eat them in full, they nourish you and help your body heal and protect you. And I wasn't a baker at all before I started doing this. I was a box mix baker, and I could burn box mix brownies. So I had no credentials for baking.
Yeah, so I'm curious there. So let's get into your stories now. So you guys have all of these facts about bread, and there's couple more I have more questions and more facts I want to get to here, but I think we should pause and I want to hear each of your stories. So Sarah, you were just about to share yours. So what in the world made you go on this wild journey to learn all of these facts about bread and grain and sifting and unsifting?
Yeah, I wish I had like a really cool story about how intentional I was and wanting to better my health and wellness, but it's a little bit more embarrassing than that. So I'm single, I'm not currently married, don't have kids, and I travel a lot for work. And so I eat at restaurants most of the time. I did not grow up learning how to cook or to bake. We just always grew up going to restaurants where my mom would cook. And so when COVID closed the restaurants, I didn't know what I was going to do. I think I bought like green beans and Life cereal and some eggs, and that's about all I was going to survive on. Through a series of God-orchestrated events and conversations, I learned that whole grains are the most nutrient-dense food in the world, one of them, and that by milling it into flour, it exposes more surface area of the grain for your body to access those nutrients and put them to work. And so the logic of it made a ton of sense to me. And then I actually had an ex-boyfriend whose mom, years before this, made her own flour, which I thought was crazy. I'm like, why would you make flour? It's so cheap. This is just ridiculous. But she, I knew that she did this, and so I gave her a call, and she told me how she'd been milling her own flour for 40 some years, and it was super good for you. And she started pointing me to all of these resources, and I just went down this fresh flour rabbit hole. I mean, I was researching from universities and medical institutions and reading customer testimonials, and I was staying up, on a work night until 3 or 4 in the morning, just deep diving all things fresh flour, and all of the research was pointing to the same thing, that this is the way we're made to eat. So I went in, kind of dove in head first. I bought 18 gallons of wheat and the second to last mill available in America. Keira got the last one.
18 gallons. That is diving in head first.
Especially when you can't make box mix brownies hardly. And I made, for the first time in my life, freshly milled bread. And I made about every mistake you can imagine. It wasn't a very pretty loaf from my lack of experience, but it tasted amazing. And I almost instantly felt better. I slept great that night. Normally when I would eat food, I would kind of carb crash or get a headache, that sort of thing. No headache, total clarity of thought. I felt like I had great energy the next day, so I think I dove in for pancakes or muffins, something like that. And it sort of became a joke. I'd be on Zoom calls for Bible studies, and people would be like, "Are you working out?" I'm like, "No, I just keep eating these cinnamon rolls." And they're like, "You look great." I'm like, "I know." But come to find out, I was eating, I'm not recommending this as your diet, but at that point in time, I was eating like 80% freshly milled bread products every day for several months. I went all in because it's the only thing I knew how to make, frankly. But in that time, I happened to go to my annual physical. I've had the same doctor for 10 years. I'm an engineer. I love data and consistency and all those things. But I had been suffering from chronic nerve pain from a work injury, and the doctors had told me there was nothing that they could do to fix it. It was very discouraging. I was in constant pain. Just thinking about it is stressful. But anyway, my nerve pain was going away, and I hadn't had a headache. And at my annual physical, my doctor came out and she said, "You must be eating real food. Your numbers are perfect." And I'd lost 6 pounds of fat, maintained the same muscle. My inflammation had dropped in half from where it was the previous year. Perfect cholesterol, perfect triglycerides, and my liver was twice as healthy as it had been in 10 years. And I already had a healthy liver. So I was ecstatic. I called Keira because she was my friend and she was a baker. And I just told her about my results. And we'd kind of gotten started at the same time with this whole milling journey.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
It kind of sounds like a conspiracy theory in some parts. So how into conspiracy theories are you?
We love them.
Okay. That's funny. So
depends
the
on the
conspiracy theory became bread.
Yeah.
Which I still want to ask about the processing, but we'll do that here in a little bit.
But you've talked about how it's changed you. So tell me, did you start sharing this with people? Did you see it start to make changes in other people's lives as well?
So there's a couple of stories that really stood out in this time, and I know, Keira, you'll share yours in a minute, but one of my family members is pre-diabetic and has been for many years, no lifestyle change, on medications, so forth. I was convinced from the research that this could help my family member. And so they started eating 2 chocolate chip cookies made with freshly milled flour every day. That's all I could get them to eat. 2 cookies, not even good for pre-diabetics. Within 1 month, their doctor took them off of prediabetes medications because they're no longer pre-diabetic and reduced their blood thinners, which again lines up with all the research. The study that Keira shared earlier about lowering your risk of diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and so forth, what we like to point people to is that it's independent of all other risk factors, which means even if you have a sedentary lifestyle, even if you smoke, even if you're eating, sugar and drinking pop 24/7, adding whole grains still improves your health outcomes, or at least lowers your risk. And
So
so
was
we've
that the
seen
case with the person eating the 2 cookies a day? That was the only change
That
they
is the
made?
only
Like they didn't
change.
start eating salads too or
No,
anything?
actually, they didn't know that they were eating freshly milled. Their spouse was making them and just leaving them on the counter. And so they would come by and graze on the cookies each day. So it just became part of a routine, but continued to eat, Sunbeam bread. Nothing against Sunbeam, but it's commercial bread. It's stripped
Sure,
of nutrients,
yeah.
all the things. No lifestyle change. They actually had COVID. And so they were suffering from long COVID symptoms at the time and really not able to be active and so forth. So that's one case. And then there's another case of a lady that I did not know well, but had worked with for a few years. And she had been away from work from having very aggressive cancer. And I knew that she was suffering and not doing well. So I actually called, I can't remember which hospital it was, like Mayo Clinic or something. And I went through a series of people to find the nutritionalist. And I said, for this specific type of cancer, can they eat whole grain wheat? And they said yes. And so I knew that this could potentially benefit based off of the research. So I called her. I said, hey, can I please just make you some banana bread? I'm just convinced. And at the time, she was not able to eat really anything without being in excruciating pain. She said, okay. I drove all the way across town. I took her this banana bread, and she texted me the next day and she said, Sarah, I feel better than since before my diagnosis. It helps with regularity. So it helped with regularity for her and for her husband the first day. And she said that she was all in. And so immediately started teaching her how to do this. And then it ended up being that she made our muffins, and that's all that she took with her when she went in for surgeries and so forth. So it's just really fascinating when you know someone personally that you care about and nothing has worked for them, and then you add a muffin or a cookie or a pancake and you see their lives transform.
Yeah, no, that's very fascinating. I think from a Christian perspective too, something that I find interesting, and I'm trying to figure out how to ask the question in my head right now, is, for people, especially people that grow up in Christian circles, right? When an illness hits a family member or something, often the response, though it's a good response, is to, pray for the family member, right? And a lot of times you pray for healing for somebody and they have one of the issues you just mentioned, right? And healing doesn't come. And that's fair. Like, God can choose to heal who he wants to and not heal who he doesn't want to. But as I'm listening to you, I'm also thinking so much of what we decide factors into that as well. And so I guess how do you reconcile that praying for healing idea, which again is a valid idea, with kind of what you've been learning with bread and the very clear results that you've seen with it?
For me, God made the whole grains, and so just healing in general, I believe God chooses who he heals, when he heals it, this side of heaven or not. But he also created our bodies, and he created food. And so they're not independent. And so for me, it's like, for my healing journey, I didn't know if I would ever feel well again. Mm-hmm. I have struggled with chronic stomach pain all of my life. Anytime I ate, I had terrible acid reflux. I had been hospitalized. I kind of thought it was just normal.
Did doctors ever point to gluten specifically as causing your health problems? Or?
Yeah, I tried low FODMAP, all of these different diets, and none of them got me well enough. So I was on really strong PPI acid reflux medication.
Okay. What was the best diet that you had tried before all of this?
Don't eat any orange juice, no tomatoes.
Okay.
Just cut out any bread. Meat
So
sometimes
anything,
mess with
acidic,
it.
basically.
Nothing acidic.
Huh.
Yeah. But that's pretty limiting of
Sure,
what all.
yeah.
And I grew up in a family where my mom made a lot of bread. And so the hospitality and the warmth behind baking is something I wanted for my kids. And so
And did your mom mill her own bread
No.
too, or no?
No.
Okay.
We just used
Store-bought flour?
Store-bought dead flour.
Okay.
But,
Dead flour.
I mean, I didn't know any different at the time. So for me, like, I didn't know if I would ever feel well because the doctors were like, take this medicine. It's all we can do. And I tried to get off of it multiple times and I couldn't. And it was honestly a new idea for me when I was in a wellness group and they were like, you should be praying for God to show you which doctor to go to. And this was like many years ago. And I feel maybe a little embarrassed but it was like a new concept for me of like, oh, God is in control of even that. Like, there's a part of me that wants to like type A, like power my way through this and be like, I can heal myself if I find the right path.
Well, and there's a logic to it too, right?
I'm
to going and seeing a doctor and getting the medicine because, I mean, we're in the 21st century. Like, we have medicine, we have the answers, right? So there's a very logical thing. And, you know, I think sometimes the praying for the healing and even the unsifted flour, right? It feels conspiratorial. And so, yeah, that makes total sense.
And it's like, what's the next step? I might not ever know. Like, I had no idea I was going to be milling my own flour. Actually, my aunt used to do that. And I thought, why would you do that? Like that, just why? I don't think I would do that. At the time when I first heard like I should be praying about what next step, I was on like a no sugar diet, like no sugar, no potatoes, all of that. And so that is not where I ended, but it was a step that led me to someone that talked about praying and believing like that Jesus would lead you. And then I had tried lots of other steps along the way and I could never find, like, they helped me. I got better. I was in less pain, but I could never get off my medication. I kept like anytime I try to get off my medication, I'd have a huge flare up and the doctors are like, you're probably just always going to be on it. But it like the medication I was on like reduces your chances of all-cause mortality are like way high. Like it's really terrible to be on that medication. So I did not want to. And it's just like the kindness of God in my story, even like I had looked into milling flour a year ago, but I had a baby and there was no way that I was going to do it. And then the fact that Sarah and I have sat next to each other, we're both engineers. We both sat right next to each other like at work for like 10 years, not always sitting next to each other, but we knew each other. And at the right time, when God chose to, he chose to have her call me and tell me about fresh flour when I had a 1-year-old, and there's no way I was going to be able to research mills. And so that's where it's like back to the praying, and like, it's not this hokey thing of like, it's a removal of like, who am I trusting? Am I trusting in myself or am I pointing to God and believing that he will show me where he wants me to go and he will use other people? And it's like, just like over and over, I just studied Revelation. It's like always pointing back to him. Like I'm grateful that he used Sarah, but it was like God that used Sarah. And I believe that like he just brought fresh flour in at a really low point in my life. And so it was like a hobby. And I started eating it and started feeling that I could eat it. And I'm like, what? I don't feel so bloated. I am not having terrible acid reflux. I'm not waking up at 3 a.m. in the morning in pain. What is this? And then after a month and a half, I got off of that medication that I'd been on. And it's from eating like 3 to 5 servings of bread. And my kids, who had been terribly constipated, we were like shoving prunes in them as much as we could. Now I'm like not feeling guilty about giving them a muffin. And I'm like, please eat a muffin because I need you to get regular. And so it just transformed our family from kind of feeling guilty about bread and just, we were actually satisfied. I was losing weight and I'm off medication. And now it's like, oh my goodness, I have like God just used it to give me like a new breath in life instead of just feeling like kind of tamped down and just like always in pain, of like this freedom. And so that has like translated into how I see bread in the Bible a lot too. Back to your original question, just Jesus as the bread of life has a much deeper meaning to me now with how he's used it and how he's walked me through to this. And so he is the bread of life. I'm not trying, this is just a pointer here on earth. I'm not at all trying to point to bread as the savior here. Jesus is the ultimate savior.
That's fair. So are you on any medication now?
No.
Not any at all?
No.
Okay. Any special diets? Can you eat acidic things again?
Yeah. I do eat tomatoes. I do eat orange juice. I limit them because sometimes it just
Fair
eventually
enough.
causes problems, but I couldn't eat it at all before. If I'm on vacation, I take bread with me because my acid reflux comes back if I don't eat it. So my body has to have the fiber and the digestive enzymes. So I am hooked for life.
Fair enough. You mentioned the enzyme again. That was the
Yeah.
second thing that we started off with that I wanted to ask about. What is this enzyme?
So there's two enzymes, one protease and amylase. One digests the carbs and one
Okay.
digests the gluten. And so gluten isn't actually the enemy. It's leaving. The problem is that dead flour at the store leaves your body stranded with no enzymes to help you digest it. It's just like, good luck. Hope you have fun. But when you eat it and you mill the flour at a low enough temperature to keep it active, now the endosperm has the amylase, has some, but the germ part has most all of the amylase and the protease. And so it's going to help actually digest the gluten, which is the glory of it, because now it's not the enemy. It's just part of how your bread rises. Gluten is just a formation that allows the bread to trap the CO2 gases. And so it's only a problem if your body can't digest it.
Okay, so gluten is good for us when it has those two enzymes that I'm not even going to try to pronounce. But when it has those enzymes, it works together. But basically, we're treating gluten as the enemy now because we've separated it from the enzymes.
Yeah, without
Okay.
those enzymes, it is very hard to digest, and it does make you bloated.
And our bodies just like can't process it without those enzymes? Like what makes it?
It's true for a lot of things. Before I got off my medication, I was taking digestive enzyme capsules just to
Okay.
process my food before I ate because I needed that much help just to be able to process. And so many people are on digestive enzyme pills. This is just an example of a whole food source directly when you're milling it.
And it's not that it's impossible to digest the gluten on its own. I mean, many people don't have any sensitivity to gluten. Like I didn't think, even though I got headaches. But all of us benefit from that enzyme to break down the gluten and properly digest it, especially if you're gluten sensitive or gluten intolerant or have some sort of health issue where they don't recommend gluten. Now, this is separate than celiac. Celiac is a gluten allergy or a wheat allergy. So we're not talking about celiacs, but if you have a gluten sensitivity, this enzyme is often the missing piece that your body needs to be able to digest the gluten without the negative consequences.
Okay. And so you also said that, so we're taking out the 40 nutrients, we're taking out the enzymes, but you said we're adding a lot of other processed things. So what processed things are being added to our bread?
Yeah, so at a very simplified level, there's three parts of the grain: the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. When you crush that grain into flour, you commercially sift away the bran and the germ. So you're just left with the endosperm, which is more or less protein and starch. After it goes through that processing, it's stripped of those nutrients and it's pretty much dead. And when commercial milling first entered America, 1917, 1920 time frame, people were thrilled because now all of a sudden they could get flour across the country to more people. So they no longer needed a local mill. They could transport it with supply chains. However, within a couple years of that entering the country and all of our diets, it caused terrible health crises in the country because people were eating as much or more bread as what they were before when they were getting it from the local mill. But now the bread they were eating had nothing for them. And so the doctors actually went to the millers and said, you've got to put the bran and the germ back into the flour. But the millers had a separate revenue stream selling off the bran and the germ to cattle farmers and pig farmers and so forth. And so they weren't going to do that. Instead, they started what's known today as the enrichment program. And so when you enrich flour, and you'll see this, enriched bread, enriched flour, they are adding 4 synthetic nutrients back into the flour, which basically keep us from losing our minds and like dying right away. But they can cause a lot of other major issues from a near-term perspective as well as from a long-term perspective. One of those nutrients specifically that we see issues with is folic acid. And so folic acid is the synthetic form of folate. So whole grain wheat has natural folate, which is very beneficial to us, especially, pregnancy and, children and so forth. But folic acid, many people are negatively reactive to because it's synthetic, especially if you have the MTHFR mutation specifically.
And also to get that fluffier flour, they will bleach the flour or use potassium bromate. There's lots of things, and those can be carcinogenic and have lots of other problems, like for thyroids and other, they're just not great chemicals to have roaming around your body.
Interesting. Okay. So we've talked a lot about milling your own bread. And, I'm thinking if I'm in my 20s and maybe I live in an apartment in Los Angeles, I'm going to hear this and say, why in the world would I mill my own bread? And where does it stop? Do I need to churn my own butter now too? What do you have to say to that?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So when I first started milling, again, I lived in a small apartment. I did not bake, and I didn't have really any equipment. And so I didn't want to sink a bunch of money into something that wasn't going to actually benefit me. And I certainly didn't want an expensive hobby that I was going to get tired of in a couple of weeks. Quite the opposite, though. Totally transformed my life.
Which might be shocking anyway, if I'm like in my 20s in Los Angeles, to hear that there's apartments in Missouri and not everyone just lives on a farm.
Yeah. I know. There's no like Dorothy and Toto. I don't have a cow in my backyard. I don't wear a bonnet, when I churn my butter.
This is a very developed city for anyone who's never been here before.
Yeah, y'all should come visit Kansas City. It's phenomenal. But,
it really is.
Yeah, but that's something that Keira and I are really passionate about, is bringing our engineering expertise to our friends and family, and now to many families across the country, of how do we simplify this process to bring a modern approach to fresh flour baking. So it's got to be streamlined. It's got to be efficient. It's got to be very practical and not take up a lot of footprint in my kitchen. It's got to be quick and easy and definitely delicious and good for me.
And you've done that. You guys started a brand. I think you started it during the pandemic or thereabouts, called Unsifted. And so if you want, go check out Unsifted. I think your Instagram handle is at UnsiftedKC.
Unsifted.kc.
Unsifted.kc. Okay, I got that wrong. Please forgive me. But, I don't advertise on the show, as you guys know. I'm not going to sell you anything. But this was such a unique story and unique brand, I just had to feature Sarah and Keira on the show. So, okay, tell me about the brand. Tell me about taking this idea from something that's benefited you and friends and family, and why start a brand?
Yeah. So again, Keira and I are both engineers. We'd been working for 10 years together corporately, but during the pandemic, we both started learning about the fresh flour. We were experiencing tremendous health improvements. My family was experiencing these health improvements, and then every friend and neighbor. I would carry muffins and bread in my purse down the street and give it to strangers during COVID, and they would let me lob a roll at them, but they wouldn't come close to me, but they'd still eat my roll. And they're like, "That's the best thing I've ever eaten." I'm like, "I know, and it's going to help your gut." So we became what we called bread brains. And we just were obsessively researching this and sharing it with people. And everyone that tasted it said the same thing. They're like, "It's the best thing I've ever tasted." I'm like, "I know." And then they're like, "And I feel amazing." I'm like, "I know. God made it. It's such a gift." And so we were baking a ton. We were sharing all the time. And frankly, it was really complicated to get started back then. So there are, places across the country that you can buy grains. But saying you eat wheat is like saying you drink wine. It's like, well, okay, is it red or white wine? Mm-hmm. And then within those categories, there are, hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of wine, right? And they taste different, and you pair them with different things. Well, the same is true of wheat. Wheat is a very broad, overarching category. And within that wheat, there are 6 classes of wheat. And within each class, there are hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of varieties of that class of wheat. And they all have different personalities. So they taste different, they bake different, they're not interchangeable. You're going to have a lot of flops in your kitchen if you're not using the right grain for that recipe, because the baking profiles can vary significantly. And so we had time during the pandemic to research this because we were bread brains, but our family and friends were not interested in doing all the research and keeping, 18 plus gallons of wheat in their stairwell like I was open to. And so it became very inefficient and impractical because we couldn't stop telling people about it because we wanted them to be well and to get these nutrients. But it took us like 9 to 12 hours per person to get them set up. And you had to buy things from all across the country from different vendors, and just inefficient and so forth. And so we really didn't think of starting a business. It wasn't an intentional plan. But I was at a friend's Shabbat dinner one night. I'd been making the challah for several months for these Shabbat dinners. And at the end of this dinner, all of the friends were going around and praying, and they were all married, and I was the only like single person there. And so I was kind of in my head like, oh man, like I'm by myself, and God, don't you see me? Don't you care about me? And I'm just baking this bread for these people. And, I'm just like melting down over there. And all of a sudden, all of that just went away. And I had a really clear thought of don't sift the word. Don't sift the word. And I did not hear God's voice. I'm not saying that, but I know that every good thing is from God. And that was very convicting to me, because it's like, okay, Sarah, you've been learning about the whole grains and eating it in full, and now you've benefited from not throwing anything away, not picking out the soft, fluffy stuff, right? What parts of scripture are you throwing away because you want the soft, fluffy stuff? Eat it in full. It's all to nourish you. It's all to protect you. And it really, really shifted my perspective of how I approach God's word in terms of not sifting away the pieces that are hard or confusing, but rather saying like, God, show me what you want me to see in this, and teach me, even if it's not right in this moment, show me eventually. So went home, told my mom the story, and she's like, yeah, it's Unsifted. I'm like, that's the name of the business I'm going to start. And I'm like, I'm going to start a business. And
so
I'm
as soon as your mom said Unsifted, you're just like,
I'm sitting
that's
there.
it. I'm starting a business.
That's it. Literally how it happened. We're sitting on the back patio, and she's like, yeah, it's Unsifted. I'm like, that's what I'm going to call my business. And I want to make it as easy as possible for anyone to benefit from fresh flour nutrition. And I want to point to the unsifted truth of scripture, because it's all from God. And that's what we need more than any of the bread, is the true bread of life that fully satisfies. And then kind of the third aspect that came out of it is, I'm a people pleaser by nature. I'm accommodating personality, all the things that, counselors tell you are not healthy for your well-being. But there's parts of me that I sift away, maybe to be liked or whatever it is. And pieces of my life that maybe are sinful or not good, and I'm ashamed of, and I don't tell anybody about that. And so for me, it's a reminder of like, unsift that, like tell the truth about what's going on in the light of Christian community, like shine the gospel in the dark places of your life and let God come in and heal it. And so Unsifted's been super impactful for me from a word perspective for those three reasons. So had this idea, I sketched it out on a piece of paper, I drew a quick logo, and then I called Keira, who I don't know if I'd ever called you before. I mean, we sat together at work, but we weren't like friends. I mean, we didn't hang out or anything. But I'd called her about the mill about a month earlier, and I said, just trust me, there's 2 mills left on the internet. I promise. I found it on page 80 of Google. It's this lady in the middle of nowhere. She went in, I went in, and then we kind of parted ways. I had all these health improvements. I'd called her after my physical, and she'd had health improvements. And then, I don't know, a couple weeks after that was when this kind of prayer in the name came through. And so Keira was the first person that I called.
And now there are a lot of mills on the internet. You guys sell the mills, and you sell these starter kits.
Yes.
Right? So exactly what you were talking about, all that 12 hours of research that you would spend on each person is now in a kit, and you explain the different types of grain, and it's all on your website. And so I encourage anyone that's listening, again, I'm not getting paid for this. You're not a sponsor. This is this is just a really cool thing you guys are doing. So I encourage anyone that's listening to go check it out. But back to the original question, and we'll close the show out with this. You said don't sift the word, and that's a part of Unsifted and what you do through that. And so with that, not sifting of the word, what does the Bible have to say about bread, and why does it talk so much about it?
First, we'll say it's a continued study for me. So I don't pretend to even begin to grasp all of the truth of God's word. So I know that that's probably an unnecessary caveat, but truly the older I get, the more fascinated I am by coming to God's word and knowing that it's true, and then studying it and putting it to the test. So, but for me, I always wondered, why does Jesus say he's the bread of life if bread is bad for us? It's a bad analogy, right? It's like, well, everybody likes bread, so everybody should like Jesus. Well, everybody doesn't like Jesus, actually. And so what did he mean? And when I started realizing that it's what we did to the bread that made it bad for us. But the way God made it, it's to nourish, it's to sustain. That made a ton more sense, just like Keira was describing. And so we actually went to Mardel, which is a local Christian bookstore here, and looked up, I think it's called a concordance. I don't even know. I'd never looked at one before. But I looked up bread, and the first mention of bread in the Bible is all the way back in Genesis, the Garden of Eden, which pretty much every person has heard that story. But in Genesis chapter 3, when God is cursing Satan and Eve and Adam, he tells Adam, by the sweat of your face, you'll eat your bread. He actually says lahem. Lahem is the Hebrew word for bread. Some translations, modern translations of the Bible, will change that to food. Because God couldn't have meant bread because, bread is bad for us. But actually look at the Hebrew of the historical text, and it's lahem. And where was the bread of life born? Where was Jesus born? In Bethlehem, house of bread. And so that's just like the tip of the iceberg of things that are in Scripture that absolutely open up once you've experienced the physical reality of the gift of whole grains, the gift of bread that God's given. And that points to a spiritual truth of nourishment and sustainment. There's so many verses in the Bible that, we've learned about, over the years now through many people who've even gone before us. But like in Deuteronomy, it talks about don't take a man's millstone or even his upper grindstone as a pledge. So if he owes you a debt, don't take his mill as a pledge. In doing so, you're taking his life. And so we've all given away our millstones and our lives are crummy, like we have bad health and so forth. And so in the Bible, it's been recognized that bread is to sustain and is to nourish us. And then even we met Sue Becker during COVID, and she told me a verse that was just phenomenal. We told her about Unsifted and all these things. And she pointed me to Luke 22, where it's right before Jesus is betrayed, and he's talking to Peter, who is Simon. And Jesus says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat, but I've prayed for you that your faith would not fail, and when you've turned again, strengthen your brothers. Well, when you sift wheat, you're sifting the flour, you throw away anything useful. And so that's been our prayer through Unsifted is like, God, don't throw away the useful parts of us. Don't let us get so absorbed in this business that we miss sharing who you are. Like, help us to point to your truth and to steward this well. And prayer is truly that this knowledge would be more accessible to more people, that they could transform not only their lives, but the lives of the other people that they love as well, physically and then spiritually through who it all comes from.
Yeah, that's great. Something you said in there I think is pretty relevant for our day and age too. You said that Jesus calls himself the bread of life, and a lot of people don't like bread. And, I think a lot of people, myself included, have only experienced the processed, the watered down, maybe for lack of a better term, where only a portion of it, and then what they have is highly processed, right? And I think so many people experience Jesus like that in our culture. And so many people are hurt by churches in our culture because they get the nutrients and the enzymes of the gospel removed, and you add in fluff and you add in show and you add in all the stuff that we know makes church weird and not a fun place to go to sometimes.
That's exactly right. And you triggered another thought for me of, I have had health issues. I have an autoimmune disorder, Hashimoto's hypothyroid. I've had major issues since COVID and so forth. Fresh flour is one tool to heal, but not the only tool. And we kind of talked about that. But I got totally caught up in kind of the law of health and healthy eating. And I was living almost in a state of panic all the time because there's so many rules. Like, all the diets tell you to cut out bread, like no carbs, no gluten, it's the enemy. And also no sugar, and only eat broccoli if it's raw, or don't eat broccoli if it's raw, and don't drink water within 30 minutes of lying down, and like all of this rules. And it created so much anxiety and fear. And we hear that from our customers. They're confused. And the Bible describes that as like sheep without a shepherd. They're confused. Helpless and harassed is how the Bible would describe it when you don't have a shepherd pointing you to the truth. And Satan causes chaos, and God brings order, and he brings peace, not fear. And so eating this way, by adding the fresh flour, it was like experiencing grace from a food perspective rather than the law that the world says, like, be perfect and then be well. But God says, here's this food that's here to nourish you, and it's the grace of the food. And there's actually a story in the Bible. It's in 2 Kings, where there's a famine in the land, and they're making stew with some stuff that they found, and it turns out that they put a poisonous gourd into the pot. And so they're like, oh no, we've eaten this poison. And Elijah actually sprinkles flour on top of the stew, and that makes it safe for them to eat. So just like we talked about with the study, independent of other risk factors, adding this to your diet, it actually caused the fiber in the whole grain wheat, in the fresh flour, causes your body to create different types of bile. And the bile is like a toxin magnet. So it sucks it out and clears it out of your system so that you can combat these diseases and you can heal. And so it's just a very grace-based approach to getting better, to eating healthier, as well as to not having to feel like you have to be perfect. And that's the gospel, right? The gospel is you don't have to try harder. Like Jesus did what you can't do for yourself. Like he's the grace that we all need, and he's the perfection that we can achieve. And so anyway, those parallels have just been very, very impactful to me over the past few years as well.
That's amazing. I love it.
So I've been doing a Revelation study recently, and this was just really striking to me. I've been looking at bread in the Bible, but for some reason this caught my eye in verse 21, where it's talking about the Babylon being thrown down at the end of times. And one of the 4 things that's listed that will be no more, there's all these beautiful things, not the sound of harpists or flute players, no more craftsmen of any kind, and the sound of the mill will be heard no more. And I just was struck by that, because I thought, really? That's one of the few things we're going to list as something. And so it caused me just to kind of dive into all the places that millstones, because Sarah mentioned Deuteronomy saying don't take someone's upper millstone. And at that time, I don't know if you guys are familiar with millstones, there's an upper and a lower. The top one usually had a hole in it. And so you and there's verses across the Bible about, talking about end times where 2 women will be milling and one of them will be gone. I think that's in Matthew 24, I think is where that one is. So in mills were a part of the culture. It's now we've delegated that to someone else. And so we don't see mills in our everyday life. But at the time, it was just a practical and symbolic. It was an essential tool. You needed it for food production because it was healthy at the time. It wasn't this guilty thing. It was livelihood. And then across the Bible, you'll see them talking about throwing a millstone and dragging someone down to the depths. So there's judgment there too. And so I feel like I'm just getting into the tip of this study, but it's so intriguing to me just how the millstone is referred to and compared similarly to, you need it to make bread. There's a transformation process that happens with it, just like there's a transformation process that happens when we believe in Jesus. And you can't do it yourself. You need, God is the only one that's going to transform. He's the judgment in that millstone. There's this community around it. So I'm having a hard time putting it all because it's still kind of fresh. I just think it's so beautiful how much depth there is in Jesus being the bread of life. And then even the millstone references all the way from Old Testament to Revelation. It's this community. There's just so much more than, oh, that's how I get flour. And that's something I love about this too, is that God just makes people hospitable. Something about the smell of bread and just being able to provide something, like Sarah shared a story. There's so many stories of where you share it with someone and it just helps them. And I love that when people try it, they just want to help someone else. The first thing is oh, I know this person that has that. I want to give it to them. And so there's just so much depth in the Bible that's throughout. And then I feel adds depth to my life just by seeing how sustaining it is and how satisfying. And then just a biblical hospitality. I just think it's beautiful.
Well, and it's also a blessing for our modern day and age that the mill you guys sell is a lot smaller than the millstones of old. It's the size of a coffee maker, right? And it's electric
smaller
too.
Than a blender. Yeah.
And it's electric. You push a button and you don't have to grind the flour anymore.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So you just scoop the grain, pour it in, push start, and 10 seconds later, you've got a cup of flour ready to bake whatever you want. Pasta, brownies, pizza, cinnamon rolls, cookies, you name it.
That's amazing. Well, we are definitely out of time for the show.
I will say for the skeptics out there, we have amazing research linked on our website with sources cited. So you can dig till your heart's content, but just have fun going down the fresh flower rabbit hole. It's unsifted.com, and then click on the Learn page if you want to dive in.
Cool. And I will put a link to that in the description for this show. So hopefully it shows up on whatever listening platform you're listening on. Thank you both so much for being on the Christian Skeptic podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for listening.
And with that, as always, I hope you guys enjoy the show.